It's nice to see you. This is Jeffrey Tucker from Liberty.me and the Foundation for Economic Education, and Carey Wedler, who needs no introduction. You're running your own media empire now, so right?
You flatter me.
Increasingly so, yeah. So, and this is our second hangout, and so really third if you don't also include the real life hangout we had in Los Angeles.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. But so we thought tonight might be a good idea to talk about all the issues that sort of are libertarian oriented, that the desperate cry for new freedom, that are not necessarily partisan. They're not related to a person's political ideology, but they just speak to who we are as individuals and our love of freedom, which I personally think that the love of human liberty really is a universal longing, and it's just a matter of sort of finding out, the thing that that sort of calls out that inner libertarian in all human beings. So, so the first issue I'd like to propose along these lines was actually in the news today, because the House of Representatives has voted to defund the NSA's big spying unit, the one that collects global data from cell phones and from emails and everything, not on any kind of suspicion of wrongdoing, but just as a routine operation of keeping a kind of a forever log of our digital lives. The House of Representatives has voted overwhelmingly, I think there were 88 votes against it, to defund the entire program. And it's very interesting to me because, I guess on one hand, you look at this and say, well, that's great. On the other hand, you look at it and go, well, it took you long enough. I mean, how did you let this thing go through in the first place, So, so that was my sense, and then of course there's still the issue of whether or not it's going to get anywhere in the Senate, right? So, and it probably won't. And even then, I mean, if let's say the House and the Senate come with the same bill, and I don't believe that anything is going to change. I mean, ultimately, it's not like
of course not. It hasn't quite restored my faith in democracy. But it's impressive. For me, it's impressive because usually when the left and right agree on something, it's something that's really detrimental to society. It's either like war or the police state. And so it's really rare to see that they're agreeing on something and that agreement is actually representative of people's concerns about it. That never happens. So it is a nice little glimmer of positivity amidst a sea of horrible crimes.
Yeah, and it's a kind of a reminder that it's like the government is so remote from the people in many ways. There's the deep state, the bureaucracy. American people have very little kind of connection to it whatsoever, and much less control over it. But there is this one tiny little piece of government that has some vague connection to the people, and that really is the House of Representatives, in the sense that at least you tend to know who they are. They do. They have to run for re-election, every couple of years, and so there is a little bit of a public capacity of public to pressure them. So the vote today suggests to me what I thought was true all along, ever since the Snowden revelations, that there is really truly mass outrage in this country towards this entire program. I remember when East Germany, the East German communist regime, fell after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The very first thing that people did, I mean, like masses on the street, was raid the Stasi headquarters and destroy all the records. I mean, just to smash the spying state. I mean, like average people everywhere, loathe the spy state and can't stand the surveillance and the data accumulation. So it's this is to me a really big populist issue. And it's about time it become an actual political issue.
Exactly, and I think it's really telling because it is such an individual issue. It's people that are disturbed about the fact that the government is directly intruding into their lives. They're not just taking their tax dollars. They're not just dropping bombs around the world. The government is literally in their phones. They're in their heads. They're watching their Google searches. I mean, literally reading our minds. And it's good to know that at least if the people are going to be ignorant and they're going to be apathetic, at least there's some line that can still be crossed that really gets to them, and I think this is it.
Yeah, and it should have been an issue 5 years ago. I mean, I remember I was in I'm sure you've been over there because you live in California, so you probably drive around the West all the time. But right outside of Salt Lake City in Utah, the
I've been
NSA.
to.
Yeah. So right. So did you ever drive by the place outside of Salt Lake, and I forget now the name of the town, where the NSA is building like the equivalent of a gigantic city that's
Yeah.
government owned, that does nothing but house, the data from. I mean, and that took place, without any kind of congressional oversight. I mean, I suppose there's some vague approval from some committee or whatever, but the whole thing is like totally out of control. To say nothing of, the absence of public debate, which is what drove Ed Snowden crazy. I mean, that's sort of why he did what he did. He was just appalled that all this would go on without any kind of public knowledge whatsoever.
Yeah, and I mean, especially speaking to the facility in Utah, I mean, I haven't been there, but it's $1 billion. That is a lot of money. I mean, it's nothing compared to the American empire, but the fact that that kind of money is being spent and people aren't aware of it, and it's like the government is taking people's money in order to intrude upon their privacy. And that could be said for any government issue, whether it's parking tickets or speeding tickets or any other kind of fine, but this is especially offensive because it's like you're funding your own violations. It's
Right.
so twisted, and I think it's finally to the point where people are starting to realize that, like, they're realizing that they're paying for this and they're really offended by it. And
Right.
it's really nice to see, because I really thought the day wouldn't come, but the fact that the House is voting in this manner shows that they're under significant pressure, and that's really cool.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because, again, to me it fits right into this whole theme of, human liberties in the interest of everybody, and it has nothing to do with left or right at this point. So a related issue, and I would love for you to pick your own, is, and something that's really important to me is, and it's very related, is the abuse of people by the police. I mean, it's totally out of control. It's it's just it's nuts, and I think everybody feels it at all levels of society. This militarization of the cops. I mean, we all are terrified when we get even stopped for a speeding ticket so much.
Well, exactly. It's like everything is a risk. No matter what you're doing, we've seen that it doesn't really matter what color you are. To an extent, it does. But at the end of the day, Kelly Thomas was a white. I mean, I think he came from middle class roots. He was homeless. But at the end of the day, it's people of all colors, all demographics being affected by this. And I think, unfortunately, there is still a segment of the population that doesn't see anything wrong with it. But I think to put it politely, I think that population is phasing itself out. Like, I think especially people that are...
Wait, Karen, what do you mean phasing itself? You mean it's like a demographic issue, right?
You're right. And they're the ones that grew up in an America where they felt they could trust the government, where they thought the government was working for them. Like my parents are of that generation, and both of them are very skeptical of police, but people of that age still think, well, I paid into Social Security, and so I'm going to get it back. And they grew up in a time when the government was somewhat accountable. People were still outraged when they heard about crimes. Nixon's Watergate was a huge scandal. And today, I mean, I would love to have a president whose biggest scandal was Watergate, let me tell you. Like, I think we'd be living in a much better place. But what does that say? Because back then it was awful. But I think overall, yeah, it's especially people that are like our age and younger, I think they're fundamentally starting to question that kind of authority, and they're not sure that they want to have a government that is willing to arm their police like that, or that's willing to give that much lack of accountability to officers of the law.
Oh, it's true. I work with, of course, I work at a libertarian organization, but so maybe that's not quite fair. But I mean, I guess, but when I see the kids like just coming out of college, the way they speak about the police, it's not even like a debate. It's like everybody knows that they are the front lines of the enemies. That is the enemy out there, and there's no question about it. And they speak about it as if they presume that this is a universal value among the young generation.
Exactly. And I think, it speaks to that individual level of freedom that people are starting to appreciate more, I think, now, because, people who are probably graduating from college right now, they're aware that the war on drugs is a failure. And even if they're not aware of the statistics, they think that it's total BS that they can get pulled over and have a gram of weed in their car and be sent to prison. they know that that's fundamentally wrong. And I think that that really stems from understanding that it's their body, they can do with it as they want. And I think that that really extends into other parts of our lives as well. And I think, as we were talking about before the show started, that really extends into a lot of different kinds of freedom. But fundamentally, all of these issues come down to freedom. And even if the people who are outraged aren't aware that it's about freedom, I think it's their basic instinct to be incensed that it's being violated.
Yeah, that's right. You know, what's interesting too is that I mean, maybe it's always been true that the police have really been terrible, and we just only know about it,
Right.
most now because of YouTube and all the rest of it. And yet, I mean, it really is true that, I sort of vaguely have a sense that there was a time when you got a ticket, it wasn't because the government just wanted your money. I mean, there was a sense that, well, you were doing something wrong,
Right.
But
Or something
now,
dangerous. Or something dangerous, something that's going to hurt the public good.
And now it's just like, now is our chance to just rob your money. And that's all been true since, I would say probably since 2008. I mean, that's really changed, that the police have just become this agents of taxation, essentially,
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. It's a revenue stream. And it's so funny. I'll just share a personal story. I had a talking on the phone while driving ticket that was actually issued in 2013, but going through the system, I didn't have court for it until last week. And so it had been a year and a half. And the government wanted, it was my fault. I have no respect for government, so I missed my court date. That was just, I forgot. Like, I didn't intentionally not go. It's just like so at the bottom of my list of priorities that I forgot and I didn't go. And so the fine went from $275 to $1,275. They charged me $1,000. So I go to trial, and I got extremely lucky my cop didn't show up because it was such an old case. And I just find it hilarious that the reason the government couldn't take my money is because their own employee was too lazy to come testify. So it's like the government is just screwed itself over. It's like it can't even efficiently steal money from you. Like they can't even get that right, and it's just hilarious to me. I was really happy.
That's very interesting that you pushed it all that way, but I guess you had no choice. I mean, when that happened to me, I was actually arrested and taken to jail. So.
Oh my gosh! Oh no! For how long?
Well, it was a failure to appear. I mean, I was only there a day because I got bailed out, but it was scary, and it changed my life,
Yeah.
I mean, from then on, I was very sympathetic to anybody in jail, and I met lots of, my cellmates were all great guys, and
I bet. And that's the crazy thing to me is that the government presumes so much authority that if you forget a court date, they will arrest you. Like, they will come after you, and they will issue a warrant for your arrest. I mean, talk about, like, narcissistic and egotistical. Like, what other person is going to try to arrest you and use violence against you because you didn't show up somewhere? Like, any private company, you miss an appointment, sure, let's rebook it. We'll sort it out. Don't worry. Even if I owe you money, they'll be flexible with me. But the government's like, one strike, you are out. You're done. You owe us $1,000 more than you did before. And if you don't come, we're going to shoot you. Like, it's crazy to me. But I think that because of the issues of police brutality, people are starting to draw more attention to this fundamental problem with government and this kind of authority. At least the people I talk to, there are people who may be liberals, but they're frustrated with police brutality. And then if you take it that logical step further about how the entire system is founded on violence and the laws are corrupt and the police are enforcing corrupt laws, they sort of go, oh yeah. And it just sort of clicks. It's because it's on the tip of their tongues. It's there. They get it. It's just you connect the dots for them, and all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense.
And you wonder whether or not this is going to be. What's your guess that this will be discussed on any kind of presidential debates? What do you think? Is anybody going to talk about this police abuse?
I mean, I expect Rand Paul to, and I think even Hillary Clinton has hinted at it. But, I mean, it's really tough to take her seriously, like, considering how much big government she's advocated for. Because at the end of the day, I think that's so much of what stimulated the police state is that there's so many laws. And Americans are unknowingly committing felonies, and they're subject to so much force, or the threat of force, for doing so many things the government has mandated that they can't, that I think it's tough for Hillary Clinton to really give a genuine speech or a genuine position about being against it. Because, I mean, I would love to see Rand Paul debate her just specifically on this issue and, like, just see him crush her talking about it, because it's so obvious to me. But at least it's to the point where Hillary Clinton, the most opportunistic person, like, running for office that I've ever seen, has to talk about it. And I'm sure that if it weren't an issue, she would not discuss it at all, but it is an issue, and she has to pander to her base, and so at least she's going to talk about it.
Yeah.
I'll give her that.
So now it's your turn. What's your suggestion for a bipartisan or non-partisan liberty issue that
Well,
yeah.
I'm kind of going to steal yours because it was so good and I would love to talk about it. But we were talking about food
Oh,
freedom and
yep.
people's concerns over the food supply. So I would love to talk about that.
I wanted to talk about that because I'm interested in it. I mean, I'm a big fan of fast food and McDonald's and store-bought burritos and everything at the convenience store, and that's how I live. Except for recently, I've started to make smoothies and things. But not everybody's like me. Some people are more like you. So tell me about issues you face.
Yeah, well, I think for me, what's so great about it is I've discussed this with a lot of people is that everyone sort of finds their own path to freedom, whether it's political, maybe it's exercise, maybe it's fitness, taking care of themselves. And I think that food freedom really fits into that because people realize that they're living in a society, they're living in a place where the government has facilitated a condition where almost everything we eat has chemicals in it and toxins in it. And it's funny because this was an issue around the turn of the century, and that was the whole reason for creating the FDA. And I find it hilarious now that the food supply is dirtier than it was when they instituted the FDA, when they first started monitoring food and inspecting it. And for me, that just speaks so much to the corruption of government because especially recently, like just the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've been seeing all of these private companies making changes in order to accommodate this shifting perception of food safety. So Chipotle went non-GMO, and Pepsi's dropping aspartame. I'm sure they're sticking other chemicals in it in its place, but at least on the surface, these companies are starting to take heed of how people are feeling, and I think that that really speaks to the fundamental freedom of the free market. The government hasn't done anything. They haven't done anything to try to make food safer. I just saw one little article today about the FDA moving to label meat that has been tenderized because it can add diseases to it, and I'm like, where have you been through the entire food inspection process? Because the USDA is also responsible for letting pork get through inspection processes with feces in it. So like, it's not really enough to see one example of the FDA saying one thing is bad and moving to label it when they've literally created a society where all of the food is dirty. And so it's really important. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just have a quick story that I only found out about this year, and I wrote an article about it, and I find it just so incredibly interesting. But you mentioned like a century ago the origin of sort of meat inspection, right? The first industry to get inspected was the meat packing industry. So, and it was because there were several deaths associated with rotten meat and that sort of thing. So what's extraordinary about this is that the largest, so this is the way it actually happened, the largest meat packers lobbied for regulation because they knew that to absorb the cost of regulations is an expensive undertaking, and that they, being the largest players in the business, could afford this, whereas their lesser competition would not be able to. So they were the major lobbying forces behind it. But what it meant was that meat inspectors had to be in their meat inspection plants, during the day. Basically, they had to be paid for. But what was amazing, they used a technique back. This is 100 years ago, called poke and sniff. And the thing is that these federal inspectors were going to discover whether the meat was rotten or not. So they would take a stick and stick it into a carcass of beef or whatever, and take it out and smell it, and then stick it into the next one and smell it, and so on. So what this meant was that if they stuck it into a rotten carcass of meat and smelled it and didn't quite smell that it was rotten and disease carrying, that they would be transferring diseases from carcass to carcass, and instead of being localized with just one piece of meat, they would spread it out through the entire meat packing plant.
Right.
Causing countless amounts of disease and probably even death. And it was called the poke and sniff method, so the government regulations actually ended up like spreading disease. I mean, that was the very first great regulation in American history, was lobbied for by the biggest players in the industry, and ended up spreading massive amounts of disease. And this method called poke and sniff, I wrote an article about this for the Freeman because I did all this research and looked it all up. But
I'd love to read that.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. But this method for testing meat survived until like the 1950s or the 1960s.
Wow.
So like 50 years with no correction.
See, and the thing is, it was marketed as a huge success for public safety, I'm sure. Because I was researching the FDA and I looked at their website, and they have this whole history about how it got started and how the FDA came to the rescue to stop the corrupt corporations. And of course, they don't mention that. They don't mention that they were transferring disease and making it worse, just like they're doing right now. I mean, the USDA is so much responsible for what's happening at these plants because they instituted this sort of fast track packaging, I guess, methodology in order to make sure that food was allegedly safe. And then what happened is that people were overworked and they didn't have enough time to inspect the food. And so, I mean, unspeakable things are in the pork that's on the market right now. And I had to stop eating pork, and I love bacon so much. But I just
wait a minute. Can you explain this to me just a little more slowly? Because I know nothing about this subject, like nothing. First of all, I didn't know that the FDA had a fast pack policy.
Well, it's the USDA, so it's slightly different. It's the Department of Agriculture, because they deal with the meat. And so basically what they were doing is it was a pilot program, and the goal was, I think, to increase efficiency on production lines of meat. And so they took it from something like, I could be wrong, I have an article about it on the anti-media, but they took the production from like 1,100 carcasses per hour to 1,400, and when they were speeding it up, the workers couldn't get to all of the meat in time, but they didn't want to tell their bosses that because they didn't want to be fired. And so all of this meat was getting through without being actually inspected. And it was like bile and fingernails and just all of the things that were mentioned in The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which was the whole reason, allegedly, according to public history school textbooks, that the FDA had to be created in the first place. And so they've taken us back to the beginning of the 20th century in terms of food cleanliness. And then you look at other companies that aren't regulated by the government, especially like companies that are organic and certified by private organizations as opposed to the government. Because even government organic certification, there's still pesticides in the water. And in Kern Valley, California, I was just reading about it last night, a lot of farmers are taking wastewater from Chevron, from oil production, and they're watering the crops with that. And they're finding all of these chemicals in the irrigation systems that give water to all the crops are growing, and these things can be certified organic. So, I mean, anything the government does, they're still allowing in some degree of inefficiency and toxicity. And you could apply this to any industry where the government says, we need to make it better, let's step in. They market it as a success, and you watch the industry just be destroyed. When in actuality, I mean, look at Whole Foods. They're opening up a low-cost organic grocery store to cater to younger people. And the market really is responding to this whole movement of food freedom and of people really being concerned about what they're putting in their bodies, and the government is stagnant. They're not doing anything to help. They're making it worse. They're still approving horrible chemicals.
So you're saying that one way that the USDA and the FDA make things worse is by giving the impression that they're policing everything really well. But what that really does is kind of give a license to private enterprise to always market its products as safe and wonderful.
USDA approved, right?
Yeah. So what's the word I'm trying to look for? But it creates like a vacuum of oversight in a way. That government regulation gives a unjustified sense of safety, whereas otherwise consumers might be a little more wary, and that private enterprise then would bear a greater degree of the responsibility. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, totally. And I think especially that reminds me sort of the GMO food labeling debate, because at first I was all about it, and then I became an anarchist, and I thought, no, I don't need the government that has poisoned the food supply telling me if there's GMO foods in it. And I just sort of started to realize that the people who are concerned about their health are already reading the ingredients. They're already looking for what's in their food. They're already concerned about it. So the people that the government claims they would be reaching by labeling GMOs, I don't really think that's a priority for them. If it were, they would be looking at the ingredients. They would be looking up what sodium nitrites are, or nitrates, I'm not sure which one that is, but they'd be looking into all of these things, as most people already are, and that's what has created the demand for private companies to respond. So I think anything government does in this regard is futile or making it worse. They're either not helping or making it worse, in my research that I've done on the topic.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that they're working hand in glove with all the largest corporations.
Exactly.
And speaking of
Exactly.
looking at ingredients, I mean, I can tell you, before I ate my cheese puffs today, I checked the ingredients very, very carefully.
Did you?
I did,
And you
and
still eat them.
and I love, yeah, because it said that it had both cheddar and blue cheese in it. So I thought, well,
Ooh. See, sometimes you have to just cut your losses and take in the chemicals because it's worth it. I eat healthy, but sometimes I just need to have In-N-Out. I just need to have something that I know is bad for me. And I think my healthy eating balances it out, but that's just what I'm going to tell myself, even if I'm wrong. But I grew up on horrible food. I grew up in the 1990s, and that was before people were aware of that. And I think that's when the food supply really started to get just disgusting. I grew up on fast food and like boxed macaroni and cheese, and it's funny because my mom fed me organic. She grew her own vegetables and then pureed them when I was a baby. And then just kind of the older my sister and I got, the more she was just like, oh, fend for yourselves. And she'd buy us food. And sometimes I wonder, like, what adverse health effects did that have on me? I drank so much milk when I was a kid. And when I was 19, I ended up having a tumor on my pituitary gland in my brain. And I cannot say with certainty that that's what caused it, but it was a milk-producing tumor. So the tumor was producing an excess of a pregnant woman's hormone and putting it through my body and tricking my body into thinking I was pregnant. And to this day, I'm 26 now, so it's been 7 years since I found out about my tumor. Still, no one knows what causes it. They don't know. They can't figure it out. It's like a basic benign pituitary tumor. Nobody knows. It's just spontaneously occurs. But I have to think back on it. At the time when I got it, my dad was sort of like, I wonder if it has anything to do with your diet. I mean, you drink all of this milk, and in retrospect, the things in the milk are so disgusting. They put so many hormones in it. And again, I'm not going to make the claim like directly that the milk caused my tumor, but thinking of all the things I ingested, I wouldn't be surprised.
what is your view about foods that we're not sort of allowed to eat? I'm thinking in particular of the raw milk debate. Do you have a view on that?
Oh yeah, I find that ridiculous. I love raw milk. It is absolutely delicious. You can actually buy it. I don't think it's fully raw milk, but you can buy it at a couple of groceries out here in LA. But even if it weren't safe for you, I don't understand why it's the government's responsibility to decide whether or not you can have it. If you want to make the choice to put something unsafe in your body, it's called personal responsibility. Like anytime you ask the government to be in control of something that specific and that intimate, I think you're opening the door for them to be in control of a lot of other things that are possibly a lot more expansive.
Am I right in saying that actually if you traveled to the UK today, or to France or Spain or wherever that raw milk is just part of the diet? I mean, it's a thing that people drink all over the world, and that America is kind of sort of uniquely hysterical about this issue. Is that right?
I would say so. In my experience, I've never seen. It's funny because Americans are so big on being all brave and courageous, and it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. But honestly, they're babies about so many things. Like, we're afraid of raw milk, but we're not. I don't want to say we. I don't want to collectivize. I don't consider myself part of that. But as Americans, people tend to be very afraid of things that are not harmful at all, and totally fine with all the most dangerous things that are affecting them in the most monumental ways.
Like driving, for example. I mean, driving strikes me as like the most dangerous thing imaginable.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like, and you're not just risking, your safety because you're on the road. It's like you're risking getting pulled over by a cop. You're risking getting a parking ticket. You're risking so many things when you get out on the road, but that's totally fine. But people are terrified of raw milk. It blows my mind.
Are there other foods that you would be interested in eating? I mean, like even now, there are farms around where I live that are somehow not allowed to sell the things that they raise, whether it's chickens or, ducks or whatever, or even vegetables, really. You have to kind of like join as a stockholder, for a certain amount of. It's like some sort of legal workaround. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if they have that in California, but here in Alabama and Georgia, they have it. You join as a kind of a stockholder, like you buy stock in the farm, and then they give to you on a regular sort of ongoing basis, whatever the cool thing is going on, whether it's pumpkins or squash or or rabbits or whatever the thing is.
Right. And
That's
this is a
that's
law that requires.
well, I think that it's like a legal workaround, right? Because
Oh, I see it.
they can't sell to you directly. I don't know this for a fact, but there's something weird about this economic arrangement. And anytime I see weird things like this, it strikes me as like a workaround.
Yeah,
And in
totally.
fact, I asked the owner if it was, and he just like him hodding around, basically. So I don't know if that goes on in California, but I don't think they're allowed to bring them to market, at least not on a regular basis. There are some exceptions for farmers markets and things like that, which are allowed to sort of live outside the regulations. But
Right.
if you wanted to kind of like have an ongoing retail business, then you have to find some other way to do it. So are there other foods that are like banned that you that you're not allowed to get?
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I know that there was a lot of talk of banning, I think, pate, like duck liver, because of the way that the ducks were killed or something. But I remember reading about that. I used to work for a travel magazine, and that was one of the article topics my friend had to write. So I didn't really care about it then because I didn't pay attention to like government regulations. But I know that they were definitely moving to ban that entirely. And I don't know how that went. I mean, I do feel bad for the ducks, and so I make the choice not to eat duck because I like little duckies. But I mean, I still don't think it's the place of the government to be regulating. If people want to eat ducks, let them eat ducks. And if they're disturbed by the fact that ducks are being killed in a horrible way, then they shouldn't be eating it. Not asking the government to step in and fix it, because I can't imagine. I'm sure that there's an adverse side effect to having the government do that, and I'm sure that the duck farmers or like the duck slaughterers have noticed it.
Yes, right. Somebody mentioned in chat unpasteurized cider. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So there must be a ton of these kinds of things. Who knows where we'd be in food today if we had actual freedom? I mean, in some ways, I celebrate, modern grocery stores. I mean, it's a glorious thing that we no longer have an absence of food. And the biggest problem people have is that they consider themselves too fat,
Right.
Which is a nice problem to have, in the scheme of things, in the sweep of human history. But at the same time, under a free market, you really do wonder, how completely different food markets would be.
Well, I think we'd have a lot more options, probably a lot more interesting combinations of foods. I can't say for sure, but I mean, just looking at a farmer's market, I love going to farmer's markets. They're all over Los Angeles, and it's just so great to see this coming together of all of these different farmers who use different growing methods. Like you can go to a farmer's market and you'll find conventionally grown crops that have pesticides on them, and you'll also find organic crops. And so I think that that's really cool, because at the end of the day, not everyone is sold on the fact that GMOs are bad, and that's fine, that's their choice. And so if they want to eat food that's covered in pesticides, and I think pesticides are more concerning than GMOs, to be honest, because there's more hard evidence on it, but that's their choice, and it's offered at the market, and it's just so cool to see all of these people, just small independent businesses. It's like the ultimate free market. You're coming together, people are coming, they're looking at their options, they're making rational decisions about what they want, and it's amazing to imagine what it could be like if that could happen on a large scale. But I do see that happening right now, because Whole Foods is starting their smaller, or it's not smaller, but their sort of millennial organic market.
Right.
Ralph's carries organic vegetables, and the demand for that has just exploded. I think Kroger is the company that, it's called Simple Truth, and they've grossed over $1 billion last year because the demand is there. And it's so cool to see these companies responding and going like, hey, people are kind of pissed off that their food is filled with all these chemicals, so maybe we should give them an option that they're going to want to purchase. It's
right.
Amazing. It's amazing how the free market works. It's so simple.
Yes. So, yeah, speaking along the same lines, just this past weekend, I visited a showroom for the Tesla car.
Cool.
And yeah, I know. I don't know. Have you been to one?
No.
Okay,
I would love to.
Yeah. So, like, I know that, and people say that they're heavily subsidized because of the federal programs favoring electrical cars or whatever. But on the other hand, the big three automakers are heavily, like, I don't think that the subsidies for electric cars are anything compared to the regulatory and bailout subsidies that the big three auto manufacturers have experienced over the last 20 years. It's unbelievable. So there's a big way in which Tesla really is challenging, the monopoly. But Carey, I mean, I didn't entirely understand the whole deal with Tesla until I went to this showroom and saw the technology. And I was with a friend of mine who's a computer programmer. He sat down in the car and started playing with the dials, and he said, "Jeffrey, you're not going to believe this. This car has release notes." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, just like your iPhone, you can look and see what version of operating system it's running."
Oh,
it's
cool.
Same way with the Tesla. And what happens when they come out with an improvement, they just they just automatically send it to you.
Oh, that's so cool.
So I said, what are you saying, that this car is entirely run by software living on the cloud? He said, yeah, basically. I said, so this is an iPhone with wheels, basically. That's it. and it really was
probably better battery life.
Yeah, right. But it is an epic thing. I mean, just the extent to which. I mean, I was in awe of this car, just because, and I know all the limitations. It's only got 250 miles, and it takes an hour to charge, and yada yada yada. But on the other hand, it's the first iteration. I mean, the iPhone wasn't so hot when it came out, and neither were computers. So, in any case, I love the experimental element, and it seems like, from a pure technological point of view, it's leagues ahead of the typical car on the road.
It is, and I mean, I think their philosophy as well is just so revolutionary because, from Nikola Tesla to now, they have such open source attitudes about their product. Right. Like, they make it public, they make it available, and I think that that's such a more productive way to go about their business, and it also adds to the reason people like them so much, because you can see that they're not just in it, they're not trying to monopolize their technology, they want to share it with the world, and that's a company I would love to get behind. A company that's generous, a company that's concerned about the planet, that's concerned about their customers, and about making the technology accessible. I think they're really staying with the spirit of Tesla's whole vision and his whole philosophy. Right. And for me, that's something that when I have the money, I'm not going to say if, when I have the money, I would love to have a Tesla. That's definitely a goal of mine.
But they're falling in price. They were like $125K. Now you can get them for $75K, which is so outlandish. And on a payment plan, there's a lot of people who could deal with that. But within the next 12 to 18 months, I'm guessing that they're going to get that price down to probably the starter car from Tesla is going to be in the 35 range, and then it's just going to fall and fall. I'm really optimistic about this.
Me too.
So this is another issue. I mean, it's a deregulation to allow alternative forms of transportation. Not just in terms of like Uber and these kinds of things, but also these really are populist issues, but also like private automobile ownership. And it's the kind of thing that I would think that anybody would get behind, regardless of your political bent,
I know, who's opposed to like a more efficient car? I mean, who would really ask the government to step in to block it? And I know that there are people who will buy into whatever they hear on TV, but the vast majority of people, even if they don't care about the environment, like, how can you say no to that? There's absolutely no rational reason to be opposed to that kind of technology. And I think for me, that's just another example of how technology is really making freedom a lot more accessible and making it happen a lot faster.
And another issue, let's see, I think it might be your turn, because you said food, I said Tesla, so it's probably your turn to offer another issue. Do you have something else in mind?
Hold on, let's get one from the chat.
Okay, I haven't been following chat. You check it out.
Let's see, talking about milk and vegetables. Trying to think, I've been trying to really diversify the topics I write about for anti-media, because there's so much police brutality and there's so much FDA nonsense that I've been trying myself to find different topics to write about. I'm trying to think of something that really gets to everyone, left and right.
Well, I was thinking about
for me, something that's really important and that I find offends all people is the concentration of the media, of corporate Hollywood, of like the 6 major media companies. I don't know anyone from the left or right that thinks that's a great idea. And of course, they're using the government to facilitate these conglomerations. And even though people still buy into all of the things they see on TV, I know that not all of them are aware of how conglomerated the industry is, but the ones who are, left and right, just find it abominable. that there's so few sources of information and that they're all owned by the same people. And it's interesting because that's sort of a monopoly, and that speaks to the same fundamental problem of the monopoly of government. And I would love to try to make that connection with people as far as the media goes. As much as I love the media and I love the individual writers and the producers and the people that are actually making the content, at the end of the day, it's just a subsidized industry that's still monopolizing on small centers of power. I mean, the people that run Hollywood, you could probably count them on two hands. You know, and there's organizations like the MPAA, which no one knows anything about. I need to make a video about that. But it's basically all of Hollywood studio heads, and it's their corporate lobby. Chris Dodd is president, former senator. And he just hobnobs with all of the Hollywood executives, and then he goes to Congress, and he lobbies on their behalf, and they're lobbying for internet censorship. And that's, you know, I think that actually ties in. I probably should have started with this. It ties into an issue that a lot of people are upset about, internet censorship. I'm sure you remember SOPA and PIPA. They didn't pass because so many people were so upset about it. And no one could really justify censoring the internet in the name of quote-unquote cybersecurity. And they're still pushing for it, and they're still trying, and they're meeting so much opposition. And it's so great to see, especially the industries, and I'm almost done, sorry, I'm rambling, but the industries sort of like Silicon Valley versus corporate Hollywood, and they have totally opposing views on it, and they're sort of at war. And in my view, corporate Hollywood's not going to come out on top because they're failing, because honestly, they're offering bad products for the most part. I mean, we love Orange is the New Black, and I love the Hunger Games, and those are the instances of success. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, how many versions of Fast and Furious can you make? You know, and box office numbers are down. And when I was, you know, working in the industry, everyone told me that it was shrinking. There weren't as many jobs anymore because people aren't buying it as much, and it's because they can get it for free, or they can watch independent content on YouTube. And it's interesting to watch the free market sort of correcting for this hegemony in corporate Hollywood and their ties to the government, which I find absolutely enthralling and thrilling, and I'm so happy about it. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I know you love the media too.
I do, but I think what you're speaking to is really a very, very foundational issue, and one that's extremely important to me. It concerns intellectual property, because you know, copyright as we know it, you know, was basically universalized and became a kind of a global pest, you know, sometime in the 1880s or 1890s. It didn't really become effective until the 20th century. And patents, as applied to software and motion pictures and that sort of thing, are very much a 20th century thing, really post-war. But they contradict the free market in a very fundamental way, because one aspect of the market is not just the privatization of profits; it's also the sharing of information, and the fact that the goods that you make really do have kind of a common destination. They belong to everybody in some ways, and patents and copyrights are, you know, so much of a corporate thing. It's not really about individual creativity. It really is about large companies pillaging the average consumer to maintain its monopoly privileges, and that's and you know what's sad about this, from my point of view, is that Hollywood is one of the great American industries. I mean, it came along. I mean, the reason it's located in Southern California instead of the Northeast, you know, people don't often ask that question, like, why is that? And the reason is that there were all sorts of claims, patent claims, that were very effective in the Northeast over camera equipment and all the other things that they needed to make the movies. So moving all the way to the other side of the country was a way of getting away from patent claims and monopolistic control. You know, so it started off as this wonderful free market industry, gradually came under government control in the 1930s, and then finally in the 1940s, you know, was almost fully nationalized, you know, with the Supreme Court ruling, I think in 1946 or something like that. And ever since then, you know, it's like the government takes every industry and trains them. It's like, you better play our game, or you're going to be in big trouble. You're either going to play with us and be part of the ruling class, or we're going to kill you. You know, I mean, totally. You know, that's sort of the way it works.
Oh my gosh, of course, and it's really interesting to me. One of my personal crusades is against the MPAA. I saw this documentary called "This Film Is Not Yet Rated," and it really exposed the origins and the practices of this. You know, they're the thing, they rate movies, you know, PG-13, rated R, and people think of them as just this sort of parental advisory unit, but as I was saying, they're the lobby for Hollywood, and I find it fascinating that the person who first headed it was LBJ's right-hand man, Jack Valenti. And he came out to Hollywood, and it was right around the time that the Vietnam War was going on. And I find it fascinating that the MPAA has taken it upon itself to be, you know, Hollywood has this reputation for being liberal, but they're not liberal at all. I mean, they promote violence. They work hand in hand with the Pentagon on war movies.
Yep.
And then they go ahead and they rate any sex in movies R or rated X. So sex is really bad, but violence is really, really good. And they have just like the most arbitrary rulings on what constitutes PG-13 violence versus rated R violence. And I just find it fascinating that it was started by someone who worked for a warmonger. And then he came out to Hollywood and helped to perpetuate this sort of tolerance for violence. And it's interesting because at the end of the day, I don't want to blame corporate Hollywood for producing war movies, because obviously the demand is there. People want to see that. People are interested in seeing cops and FBI agents and CIA agents shoot bad guys up, you know? And I think that that's something that needs to be directly addressed with the people as opposed to going after the content producers, because at the end of the day, they're responding to a bottom line. That, you know, Hollywood doesn't make a movie unless they know that it's going to be profitable. So as much as people like to say that Hollywood's brainwashing people, which I believe to an extent, I think that the root cause is that people are hungry for that. People want to see that. And I've totally gone off on a tangent. I'm not sure what my point was, but
well, now you've maybe. I was thinking about going to the movies this weekend, and now I'm feeling like I shouldn't. I should stay home and watch Carey Wedler videos.
No, get Popcorn Timer. There's this app, and you can watch like really recent movies totally for free. Popcorn Timer. Isn't it amazing? You don't need to pay into corporate Hollywood, and they're suffering for it, and it's their own fault because they made it so expensive to see movies, and they're producing subpar quality films that really cool films are starting to crop up now because so many independent production companies are coming about because people hate studio films now. It's awesome. It's so cool to see.
Well, this is what's so interesting about all the subjects we're talking about, because, you know, in every case of government failure we're drawing attention to here, we've also named private alternatives. You know, like in the case of, you know, the car monopoly, we've got this disruptive company in Tesla. In the case of the food monopoly, we've got disruptive you know, Whole Foods coming along, and, you know, in the case of Hollywood, we've got, you know, Netflix, which has its own problems, but, you know, lots of independent media. So it's interesting to see, like, without political reform, you're still seeing these sort of disruptive companies coming along and making a gigantic difference.
Mm-hmm. And it's amazing to see, and it's something that when I was a liberal, I would have just looked at the facts and brushed them off and not paid attention to it, but it's really hard to ignore, especially, you know, I used to be really into makeup and fashion, and it's really cool even to see in industries like that they're responding. I mean, there's a lot more forms of organic makeup that don't have any chemicals in them and aren't tested on animals. And, you know, I'm wearing makeup right now. I'm not going to pretend like I don't like it. I love it.
Yeah, you don't need any makeup.
Thanks. So you haven't seen me without it. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that bad. But I do like it. You know, if I'm going to record, I want to wear some makeup. But it's cool that now I have the option to wear something that's mineral-based, as opposed to just like filth that I'm putting on my face that makes my skin break out. It's awesome. And all these organic face products, like all of my skincare is totally organic, and it's so cool. And my skin is a lot nicer now because I use those products. And once again, the market is responding. Yeah.
What about the issue of, I was going to bring this up earlier, because we're trying to like talk about things that are not divisive issues that really do set like the interest of the ruling class against populist, against the people, essentially, that almost anybody can agree with. So I wonder what your view is on this whole issue of same-sex marriage, because so I was going to name it as one of those issues that can unite people. Like, surely everybody agrees that that people should be allowed to form whatever kind of associations they want, as long as they're not hurting anybody. But I'm not entirely sure about that, because there is the issue of that of the Christian right, and there's a populist appeal to sort of demonizing the gay lobby and that sort of thing. What is your read on that situation today?
You know, I think just like we were talking about the police brutality issue, I think most people under a certain age are absolutely immune to like that kind of thinking, that it's somebody else's right to tell you who you can and cannot associate with. And so I think moving forward, it's really sort of going to be a non-issue. And I wish that it were more in the direction of, well, the government shouldn't be in charge of marriage, as opposed to, well, gay people have the right to get married. you know, and I hope that eventually that's the turn it takes. But I mean, for me, I cannot see it going back the other direction. Sort of like marijuana, which is also one of those issues that people are really starting to unite on. Like,
I think that's true. That's true. And, you know, in the case of marijuana, not to change the subject away from same-sex marriage, but in the case of marijuana, what's driving it is that older people, you know, still have very much of a bias against it.
Yeah.
But they all have children and grandchildren. Right.
Right.
And that's a big deal. So if their grandchild, you know, who's 16 years old, and you're a, you know, an aging senator, you know, and suddenly, you know, your 16-year-old grandchild is being has his parking permit taken away because, you know, because he was caught, or gets his car confiscated, or goes to jail, you know, over some silly issue. Then you have a strong incentive to sort of change your mind on that subject.
Totally. And talking about these two issues sort of makes me think of something I've been thinking about lately, which is that I think democracy itself has really sort of corrupted people, because people always talk about how capitalism makes people so self-interested and narcissistic. And, you know, from my view, I sort of look at the whole voting populace, and I think, like, what has democracy done? It's given all of these individuals this false sense of superiority and supremacy, that it's their right to tell other people what to do, that they're so important and they're so informed that they should be able to use the government and wield it in the way that they want. And to me, that's like the most egocentric thing I could ever imagine, like having this idea that it's my right, based on my views and what I think and what makes me happy, to force other people to do it. And I think that really speaks to same-sex marriage and weed, because these are two things that are so personal, it's entirely intimate, it's based on your own personal decision. And yet you have these people who have taken it upon themselves, you know, they're not coming to your door, but to sick the government on you for doing something they don't like. And I think it just, people are still so proud of their democracy, you know, and they think that America is still facilitating democracies around the world, which couldn't be further from the truth, but they believe it because it makes them feel good about themselves.
Well,
and
it's getting to be preposterous. I mean, at this point, I mean, really, I mean, it depends on who you know, who the great presidential aspirants, you know, end up being. But if it's Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, I mean, can't we just, like, at that point, just, like, can everybody agree this whole system is a fraud? Because
well, that's another uniting issue, the possibility of Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. I mean, the entire American population would be in an uproar. You know, some might still support Jeb Bush, but they won't handle Hillary Clinton, and vice versa for the left. I mean, at least there's that hope. If that's what it comes down to, I would hope, I would even consider praying. I don't pray, but I would meditate on people standing up and really just putting their foot down. That's just too far.
I totally agree. I mean, it's just, you know, it's part of me actually wants that to happen. Because
me too.
Yeah, the final, you know, the fin de siècle of American democracy, you know, the final moment, you know, it reaches its most absurd conclusion, you know. I actually have my doubts about this. You know, everybody presumes that Hillary Clinton's going to be the Democratic nominee. I just, you know, I just have a hard time believing it, actually.
Who do you think then?
Well, I don't know, but you know, and I don't follow politics, but I do see that there are other contenders that are throwing their hat, and it seems to me like a situation ripe for disruption, you know, in the same way that we're seeing so many disruptive industries. We can see the whole political system being disrupted, and people are writing off Rand Paul, of course. I think very, very clever, actually, and I've never written him off. I always thought he was just a brilliant politician, and it could be interesting just to kind of watch how this plays itself out. I mean, I'm sure you feel like I do. There's some times when you just want to cheer, you know, him, and then other times you're kind of like disappointed, you know, that he's not quite, you know, the person you sort of want him to be.
Yeah, and I'm not quite ready to tell myself that it's all just his own little game so he can get in and fix the system, but I'm also not going to tell myself that that's not possible. You know, I won't be making Rand Paul videos in 2016 like I did for Ron in 2012, but I will be willing to give credit where credit is due if he turns out to really, really be principled, and I would love to see that. I hope that that's the case. I really do.
But, and in any case, I mean, I guess part of the theme of a lot of what we're talking about here tonight is that, in some sense, whether or not we get a great political leader or the political reforms happen, is not quite as relevant, you know, in the future as it has been in the past, because the reform is happening anyway. You know?
Exactly. Organically, on its own.
Mhm.
And it's like with or without government, humanity is moving forward. And
Yeah.
the insistence of government on the stagnation and the holding back and the clinging to all these old ideals, it's just going to make it fall away faster, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think this really speaks to an important truth that I think libertarians too easily forget, namely that government does not have total control. I mean, even the most totalitarian state cannot actually run society in every detail and every respect.
Mm-hmm.
There's always leakage. There's always a flaw in the system. There's always a way out. The regulations can never be written perfectly enough to prevent all competition. Clever entrepreneurs are always at work finding ways to make the future happen, you know, regardless of the regulations. And I think libertarians, we're so afraid of the government. Sometimes and we're so morally outraged, you know, at everything the government does, that we sometimes forget that ultimately, you know, the state is not as powerful as the state likes to try to convince us that it is. Really.
Exactly. And throughout history, this has been the case. I mean, even like you said, the most totalitarian governments, there are still these outcroppings of dissent. I mean, I'm thinking, for some reason, it's calling to mind the Netherlands during World War II, where Hitler had taken over the entire country, and he was a fascist. And yet you still have these people defying the utmost authority and like really going by their moral compass and sheltering people, Jews or anyone else that were being targeted by the Nazis, and they got away with it. You know, these people still slipped through the cracks, and they were able to stick to their morals, and they didn't have to submit. And yeah, I'm sure they had to lie and cover it up in order to get away with it. But what do you do in the face of that kind of evil? I mean, you're going to stick with what's right. And it's so cool to see that even in the most dire of situations, humanity always seems to find a way to work towards freedom and to work towards what's right. And for me, at the end of the day, it's about freedom. There are people who didn't want Jews to lose their freedom because of who they were, because of just who they fundamentally were. And in all of these instances, as we've been talking about all night, every single industry we're talking about, it comes down to more freedom.
That's the universal unifying theme. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, for this country, for the world. Carey, I feel like I learned so much from you tonight, so thank you.
Oh, you too.
Well, I appreciate all the time you spent with me tonight, and I think you're just brilliant, and you have such insight, and I appreciate you sharing with me and with our audience tonight. And I hope we get to do this again real soon. Okay?
Of course, we'll figure out a good time.
Okay. Stay busy.
Talk to you.
Okay. Take care. Bye bye.